Welcome everyone to the first of our virtual horticulture classes. This one's called Planting with Natives. My name's Kristen Barker. I'm the Community Education Coordinator here at CalBG, and I'm really happy to be joined by Steven Valdez today, who's going to be teaching our class.
How's it going? Hello.
Steven is the lead nursery technician here for Grow Native Nursery. He's also a master gardener, and so he's going to go over a lot of topics today about getting you started planting with natives. So I'm really looking forward to the class. Before we truly begin, we kind of addressed these as people were trickling into the classroom, but I wanted to just point out that please feel free. I encourage you all to use the Q&A and the chat features in the webinar. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, just type those in. We'll be able to pause kind of periodically throughout Steven's presentation, but we will have a more dedicated Q&A segment at the end of the class where we'll be able to address those questions a little bit more thoroughly. So yeah, please use the Q&A and chat. Also, something that was brought up, we will be recording this class. So if you have to step away for a moment, or you want to rewatch something and remember some information that Steven mentions, you'll be able to do that, and you'll find that on the digital content page of the CalBG website, which is calbg.org. And I'll send a follow-up email with that link, so you'll have that available as well. It should be up by Monday at the end of the day, but probably sooner than that. And then lastly from me, you should have received an email from me with your $5 off GNN discount code. So if you didn't receive that email from me, just shoot me an email. I'll put my email in the chat here so that you can just go ahead and send me an email and let me know, and we'll get that situated as soon as possible so that you all can go into the Grow Native Nursery with all the information that you've got today and get purchasing some native plants. And just to let everyone know, the Grow Native Nursery is online. You'll find it in the online store of our website, and it will be open to the public on November 5th. And so if you're a member, you're already being able to shop, but if you're not, you'll be able to shop there starting November 5th. So I think that's it for me. So I'm going to go ahead and hand you all over to Steven to get the class started. Steven, thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Kristen. What's up, everyone? My name's Steven. As Kristen mentioned, I'm the lead propagation tech over here at CalBG. So what that means is I, tuck the plants in every night and read them some bedtime stories and just make sure they're as happy as possible before they're handed off to you all. I think right off the top, I want to do a quick poll just to kind of see where everyone's at with their gardening experience and interest in California natives. So this will allow you guys to try out the comment section, but it'll also give us like a better understanding of where everyone is at. So in the chat, go ahead and type 0 if you don't have any California native garden experience and are looking to get started. You could type 0 if that applies to you. Or you can type 1 in the chat if you have a native garden and are already prepared to plant and are just looking to further your interest in this field. And Kristen will help me tally up those votes. We'll see where everyone's at.
We have a 0.5.
0.5.
So somewhere in between. It's looking like half and half, 0 and 1s.
Okay.
People are mixed, but they've mentioned killing some of their plants, which is
yeah. I'm in that club too. Don't worry.
Yeah. Getting some more 1s, so that's good.
Cool. So many of you are getting ready. Awesome. Wow,
yeah, so I would say about half and half, a little bit more 1s.
Cool. Okay. Well, I won't try to get too into the weeds with some of these topics. At the end of the talk, I'll share as many resources as I can. Some of them are websites. Some of them are textbooks that I myself reference time to time. But with that, let's get started. I want to give you guys a brief outline of what we'll be covering. And you can consider this as like a more general step-by-step when approaching your own garden or site that you plan on planting. So the very first step is to really just gather as much information as you can. Just book after book, as many websites, you talk to people, visit nurseries, go on hikes, go to gardens, just explore as much of California native gardening as you can possibly do. Secondly, you're gonna, once you've gathered all that information, you'll be able to prepare your site. And that's gonna involve, you know, just weeding, of course, and other things like that. And of course, the very fun part is selecting your plants and finding things that you're gonna be planting in your own garden. And of course, the big day is planting. That's gonna have a few little steps that I'll go over. And lastly, what's very important and more specific to California native gardening is this establishment period that you hear talked about with California native gardening. All right, so let's get started. Questions to ask yourself. We're gonna get very self-reflective here, okay? So I'll go over some environmental factors that influence your site. These are factors that you don't really have much control over, but they're good to understand. So one of these things is, you know, what kind of sunlight does your site receive? Are you looking to plant a north-facing side of your property or wherever? Or are you looking to plant a west-facing side, south? You're gonna receive different quality of light as well as duration of light. Southern-facing sites are gonna receive the most light. They're gonna receive more direct sunlight and are a great area to plant flowering plants and heat-loving plants. A west-facing site will receive more of the setting sun, and typically the setting sun is a bit more harsh than the rising sun. It's later in the day. Any moisture in the air has, you know, evaporated by that time, and so there's more direct sunlight. And usually, a desert garden will do very well here, or especially if you're inland or like in the high desert. You know, some west-facing probably gets really baked on some days during the summer. Another thing to think about is things like wind speed and wind quality. If you're by the coast, you're probably receiving cooler winds and more regulation of temperatures by the sea, and that's going to make a difference in whether you select a desert plant or whether you select something that's more chaparral or more coastal. And on the opposite of that, if you're more inland, you might be receiving more eastern blowing winds that typically carry more heat from the desert. And so that's another thing to kind of factor into your selection. Also, your soil. If you really want to get into this, there are many labs that will test your soil for you. And that's, of course, if you're looking to plant, you know, acres of land with particular plants, if you're like really serious. But of course, if it's just your home, it's your backyard, there's some quick and dirty ways that you can test your soil. One of them involves a mason jar. I don't know how many people are familiar with this, but you can dig about, you know, 6 inches deep worth of soil and measure that out and put it in your mason jar and kind of mark it and mix that with water and a bit of salt. And you just give it a good shake and you leave it alone for, like, the longer the better, about a week, at least 4 days. And what begins to happen is the particles in that soil sample begin to settle. And over time, as long as you don't disturb it, you'll be able to see the different layers that form. Typically, the larger particles will settle down, and then you'll get you know, sand towards the bottom, and then the clay particles start to float to the top. And so a very interesting way to get some starting understanding of your soil. Of course, it's not going to give you like an exact reflection of what your soil is, but of course it's good to try. Everyone should try that with their soil just to see like what happens. It's very, very cool. Also, things like slope are going to determine the quality of wind. If you're looking to plant on a downslope or at the top of a slope, that's going to impact certain things like your watering schedule, as well as what you can and can't plant. Some plants do well on a slope and like very rocky hillsides. Some do not. Some prefer more riparian areas where water can collect. Okay, and so now let's go over some factors that you do have more control over, but that you should really consider before the plant selection process. One of those things are thinking about what plants you might already have in your garden. Is there a rose bush that you're really wanting to keep? Are there any trees that you really like? Or maybe there's some trees that just aren't feasible to remove. You know, they're really big and it's not really worth the trouble to go through getting it out. So just think about that as well. It's going to impact what native plants you might be able to plant near it, and will determine how you're going to water those native plants while maintaining that plant that you want to keep. And of course, everyone deals with this, the weed situation. Okay, it's good to understand what's growing in your garden against your will, and what measures are you going to have to take to get rid of them. You want to do this well before you start breaking ground and digging and planting your plants, because if you put it off, they're just going to come back and they're just going to tangle in and intermingle with your plants, and it's not going to be fun. An existing irrigation system. If you have an existing lawn, maybe you're renting and you can't really control the sprinkler system that's in ground, then you want to think about ways of maybe converting that to a system that can help you water California natives. The problem with turf irrigation systems is that they mostly apply overhead sprinkling, and the water hitting the leaves can be problematic. So you want to try to install an irrigation system that's going to target the soil and not target the leaves or the trunk. And of course, I'm sure some of you have experience with this, but there are other pests that you should be wary of and just try to see if you're dealing with. Gophers are a big one in some parts of California. And, you know, getting rid of something like gophers or ground squirrels, it really is a community effort. There's not much you can do if you're trying to go alone. What's usually recommended is trying to get your whole neighborhood to tackle this problem, because otherwise, if you treat the gophers in your property, and sure, like you might have 1 month of good soil, the next month you'll just get the neighboring gophers back in your yard and you're back to square one. So, you know, hopefully they're not a big problem for most of you, but if they are, it's definitely something you need to consider. Gophers and squirrels and ground squirrels, they feed on roots. And if you're looking to plant a perennial that you're hoping to have in your garden for, you know, the next 5 years, you don't want to have these sort of pests in your yard, and you want to, you know, ensure the best success for those plants into the future. And most importantly, of course, what do you want to get out of this garden? You know, we can talk about all these do's and don'ts, but ultimately, as long as you inform yourself beforehand, you can really do whatever makes you happy, and you should. If you want to try to grow choyas next to, I don't know, some shade-loving plants, by all means, as long as you understand what it's going to take to maintain that garden, I would actually be really interested if you manage to pull it off. That'd be awesome. And at the end of the day, try to take as many notes as you can. Try to record everything, any differences, take a lot of pictures, and just plan, definitely. And once we've done all that critical thinking, that inward thinking, we can start looking at some starting points. These templates are very helpful when you're doing Google searches, or when you're looking at people's gardens, when you're going on hikes or talking to other people. Just referencing these terms like woodland garden, pollinator garden, they're gonna allow you to hone in on some specific plants that you can put into your own garden. And of course, this is all dependent on, you know, west facing, south facing, going back to those earlier slides, understanding where you are in California and what sunlight quality and other factors are impacting your site. And what I want to touch on a little bit is fire-wise gardening. It seems to be more important lately. So there's a lot of research coming up on this, and one source that I've read is arguing that, you know, plant maintenance plays a larger part than plant selection does. If you're really comparing them, ensuring that you're clearing dead debris, ensuring that you're spacing your plants properly, ensuring that dead growth is removed, proper pruning and stuff like that. That goes a very long way. But of course, nonetheless, you still want to consider, plant structure. Is it a deciduous plant that's going to drop all of its leaves? That's something to be aware of when you're selecting plants. You don't want to, in the summer, have this thick layer of dry sycamore leaves that you're worried about. And of course, this is for those of you who just live in more fire-prone areas, foothills, places like that. It's just something to consider. Also, the production of oils or resins, flaky bark, some manzanitas flake their bark a lot, leaf litter in general. It's something you just want to incorporate into your thought process and tackle beforehand. And yeah, this is this report that I was referencing earlier. It's published by the Cooperative Extension in San Diego. And they basically designed a testing method for qualifying and quantifying flammability in California native plants. And they were trying to apply this to garden settings. So I think it's a very good read. It's a few pages. I think after the talk, I'll link it, and we'll try to get that to you guys so you can read it. Okay, so let's recap this very inward thinking segment. You want to assess your local climate and external factors of your site. Do any site prep, removing and preventing any existing plants. Design a method that's going to work for you. You want to decide on your irrigation plan if you are hoping to have some sort of either in-ground irrigation or above ground. Something like micro emitters are really great. Now's the time to kind of start thinking about that and start pricing out, what am I going to need? What can I get away with not having? And of course, take extra landscaping measures if you're in an area with greater fire risk. That's very important.
Steven,
Okay, onward.
Steven, before we move on, just to touch on a gopher question, Judy is asking, will natives tolerate the root cages you can buy to discourage gophers?
I've heard mixed results. Yeah, I guess it would depend on, root cages they're dug in, I'm guessing. They're dug in around the plant.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I don't have a clear answer for that, unfortunately. What I've heard with dealing with gophers is probably like a poison or something like that is usually what's recommended. There's also some things that you can install in the ground that emit certain frequencies. It's something to look into more, I would say. Cages I like because it's less intrusive, and it's just safer to deal with. However, I'd consider what effect it might have on the plant's root system, and you might want to think about that going forward. Is it going to interfere with any root growth, or is it going to over time, is it going to rust or break down? And if that's going to happen, then gophers might just come back. So yeah, hopefully that kind of gives her an idea.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so onward, we're going to prepare our site. So we've thought about all this, and we've gathered all of this information. Now it's time to start preparing our site. One of the things to do is to have moist soil going into planting. It's going to ensure that the soil can contact the root ball when you're actually planting the plant, and it's going to reduce any transplant shock that might occur. And this is very important for sensitive plants like manzanitas, Fremontodendrons, bush poppies, things like that. And the larger the plant, or especially if it's a larger plant that you want, that costs more money. You want to really ensure that it's going to be healthy when it's planted in your garden. It's also going to aid in the weeding process, moist soil. Now, if you live with clay soil, you don't want to saturate it too much, because then you're dealing with like very muddy situation. And I would argue that that's almost worse than having a dry bed and working with that. So you want to really find a middle ground where it's just moist enough to break and work with. And also, very importantly, with removing weeds, watering your site before you plant or begin to mulch or install anything it's going to germinate a lot of the seed weeds, the weed seeds that are in your soil bank. And what that's going to help with is you'll be able to target those and hopefully, till them over and get them out of your site. Okay, so now we're removing weeds from our site. This is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of, if you just want to get down and dirty and like use your hands, there's a lot of tools that you can use. So just find something that works for you. Hand trowels, rakes, pickaxes, stuff like that. One thing I do want to talk about is the option to solarize. So this is a way of targeting the seeds and weeds in your garden without having to, do any manual labor or apply any, potentially harmful pesticides or herbicides. And it's best done during the summer when peak temperatures are really high. If you're planning on doing this, you'll probably need to buy a tarp, like a clear tarp that's large enough for your site. There's a lot of good resources on learning more about this. And I can actually link something afterwards that talks about soil solarization. You can still do it now if you do want to. It'll just take a bit longer, like currently, because it's cooling off. You might need to do it, I believe during the cooler months, it's a 6-month endeavor. You have to solarize for 6 months. But if you're doing it in the summer, you can do it in 6 weeks. So it's a huge difference. So if you're thinking about, okay, I have this big planting project and I'm probably not going to get to it this fall, I'm going to get to it next fall, well, then solarization would be a great option for this upcoming summer, right? Because you're likely not going to be doing any planting. You're going to be leaving your garden alone, and that's an excellent opportunity. And of course, mulching. You should always mulch. Any part of your site that's exposed soil should always be covered. Especially once it starts raining, the mulch is going to slow down the water droplets and allow it to percolate into your soil rather than run off and create any sort of erosion or problems with that. And lastly, it should always be your last action are to apply any herbicides. This is part of maintaining a good integrated pest management effort. You want to try multiple things together rather than trying to rely just on this one chemical to treat your weeds. So usually it's the last thing to do if everything else does not work. And again, just always practice good IPM. That's using, different methods, hand pulling weeds, mulching over, solarizing, that sort of thing. Mulching, also, I want to talk about some more. You can use wood chips. That's, of course, the more obvious one, and any size between, I think, like 2 to 3 inches is a good size per chip. But there's also other ways you can go about it. I've read a bit about cardboard mulching, which I think is very interesting, where you just take plain cardboard from boxes that you might have hanging around. You can lay it out, and some sources recommend just putting it directly over the weeds, like not even needing to pull anything out. And what that will do is basically suffocate the plant. It'll remove any, and it'll just solarize. It'll have a solarizing effect as well, especially if you do it in the summer. And being cardboard, over time, it will break down and soften. Okay, now let's talk about irrigation. I touched on it a bit. In ground, of course, that's the sprinkler systems most of us are familiar with. Above ground, that's if we're talking about drip line or emitters. In the garden, we use a lot of micro sprayers, and I think that works a lot, especially if you can calibrate them to only hit the soil and away from the trunk of the plant. I don't recommend drip emitters because the amount of water and the frequency of the application, it's too long and too focused for native plants. Typically, you want broad, deep irrigation. But with drip emitters, it's very focused, and that area stays wet for too long, basically, and it's not really good from a soil pathogen standpoint. You're subjecting the plant to root rot. most likely. But yeah, at the end of the day, you just want a system that's going to work for you. That's going to allow you to apply a deep and frequent watering to your plant. If you want, you can just be like me and have a 100-foot hose that can reach everywhere in your garden, and you just soak the plant that way. But yeah, it's entirely up to you and what options you have. So of course, let's recap. You want to soften your soil, make it workable, remove any weeds, and mulch, at least 3 inches. If you get more than that, you start dealing with certain abiotic disorders in the soil, disrupting oxygen flow and stuff like that. So 3 inches is usually the target, 3 to 4. And if you need to install in ground, then now is the time before planting. If you're doing above ground, then you can get some work done beforehand, or you can wait after your plants are actually positioned so that you get a better idea of where your micro emitters will be going, where your drip system will be going, your drip tape, that is. Okay, now the fun part, selecting plants. Get the checkbook out, we're going. Okay, so going back to those templates that I mentioned earlier, like the pollinator garden, I'll be expanding a bit on the woodland garden, and there's one more, desert garden. So we'll start off with pollinator garden candidates. I selected plants that I've typically had good experience with. Most people have a good experience with. They're very forgiving for beginners, and they can tolerate some neglect if they have to. So yeah, we'll start with white sage, of course. It's like the go-to. It's so great. Salvia apiana. It can get pretty big, so I'll get into that a bit as well, like spacing your plants. This guy will get easily like 6 to 10 feet wide, depending. And of course, there's some flexibility there, especially if you're pruning the plant, which is totally doable. You can get away with spacing your plants closer, but of course, I'll get into that a bit more later. And there's a picture of it in some chaparral. Next is California buckwheat. That's something you encounter in, the San Gabriel Mountains on your hikes. It grows everywhere in SoCal. It's very great. And both of these plants do very well in full sun and with minimal watering, especially after being established. And these are other perennials. The first two I described as woody perennials because they do get woody over time, and that might impact how you prune them, how you water them. Because they have a more woody base, you will want to look into avoiding wetting the area by the trunk of the plant. But here's some other perennials. These are more herbaceous. They're not as tall and big. They're great for like accents in your garden or like towards walking pathways, whereas the bigger plants make a very nice backdrop for these. So some showy penstemon has a really lovely purple flower. These fluorescents get, I would say, about 5 feet tall, but the plant itself, it can get not as big as a sage, but approaching it. Desert mint, monardella. This is another little shrub. It gets a little woody, but most of the growth on it is typically herbaceous and very green and fleshy. And one thing I also want to mention is, within these genera, there are several species that you can search with. If you're interested in maybe this monardella odoratissima isn't to your liking, well, there's plenty of other monardellas to pick from. And if you're doing a Google search, you can just type in monardella California native, and you'll get dozens of species potentially. So that's just something to keep in mind. Yep, here's some epilobium, California fuchsia. This one loves the full sun. I have one in my garden, and I basically neglected it all summer, and it still had like dozens of flowers, and it was getting hit heavy with the sun. I live in Covina, so it got pretty hot some days, over 100. And of course, if there's a part of your garden that you still want pollinators in, but maybe it doesn't receive as much sunlight, you can always go with the hummingbird sage. This I believe Kristen told me they're all sold out now. Sorry. I'll try to grow some more next year. I brought some physical plants as well that I can go over if you would like to see them in person. Let's see, I believe I brought a white sage with me. Here we are. So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, white sage, this is a baby, it's a 1 gallon. Yeah, it'll go in the ground like this, and you should, it's kind of misleading. You buy this plant and you think, oh, it's going to stay this size, but no, it can get, gigantic. So give it plenty of space. And let's continue. So we've covered some pollinator garden candidates. So if you want a pollination area, you want to consider the sun quality that it's receiving. Most of these plants do well in full sun, south facing. And as a general rule, if you expect your plant to put out a lot of flowers, it's very likely going to mean that it needs more sunlight, because it's going to need that extra energy to produce flowers and nectar for bees and birds. So that's just something to keep in mind. That being said, potentially some of these plants can be planted in less than ideal situations, partial sun, but you should expect them to not look like they would in full sun. You'll have fewer flowers and a bit more leggy appearance. Okay, continuing. So now maybe you have a part of your garden that gets hit with very heavy western sunlight, and you're inland, so you're easily hitting 110-degree weather during the summer. You want to plant something that's going to be able to withstand that, and it's going to look great at the same time. And so this Penstemon etonii is a great option. It's another Penstemon, but it can withstand more sunlight. Here's a Boutilon, Palmer's Mallow. Let me show you the Penstemon first too. Alrighty, so we got another Penstemon here. You can see the inflorescence on it, and you can kind of get an idea of how tall it gets, right? It's maybe like about 3 feet, maybe. So it's not as big as the Penstemon spectabilis. So, and it makes it's a nice low growing herbaceous plant that's perennial. And this Palmer's Mallow is a really nice ashy green leaf that's very soft to the touch. It's actually very lovely. And let's talk about some woody perennials. This is a brittle bush. I have one with me as well. So here's another little baby, 1 gallon. These don't get too big. They maybe get like 3 feet wide, and they're very hardy. You can really, they can really get beat up. And of course, desert garden, you think cacti and succulents. I believe this is a Fosbergii cylindropuntia, not biglevii. But this picture can at least give you an idea of what it will look like. These make great backdrops to little herbaceous plants in the front. There's a beaver tail cactus. They're pretty slow growing, so that's something to consider when you're spacing them out. They will reach, maybe 4 feet wide in some cases, but they'll start off with maybe like 2 or 3 pads. Just something to think about. Of course, good old ocotillo. This guy's great. So yeah, all of these plants tolerate very hot situations and are great for west-facing sections of your garden. Okay, let's move on to a woodland garden template. So this is probably a north-facing part of your garden that's not receiving as much direct sunlight. This is also a good option if there's an existing tree in your lot that you kind of don't want to get rid of, or you can't get rid of. There's some plants that can complement that less direct sunlight. And so this is a currant, a Ribes malvaceum, and it gets, it's pretty woody. It can reach like 6 feet, I would say. It doesn't grow as widely in my experience. And again, this can do well in partial shade, partial sun, those intermediary areas of your garden. Here's an Oregon grape. This is a berberis. I have another one to show you. Here's a little one. Starts off small, but it can get about as big as the ribes, if not bigger. It has that lovely yellow flower. And if you're looking to just cover the ground, get some ground cover, strawberry is a great option. You can buy one plant and by the end of the winter have, several more plants that have grown from it, because it kind of spreads via stolon growth. And Kristen was asking earlier, they are edible, the little strawberries. They're very small though, like maybe marble size. Here's some coral bells. These are also very low growing. They don't get as big. It's a great accent. It's a nice pop of warm color. I believe I brought one with me. You can get an idea of how they look. And these are more herbaceous. You see there's not a lot of wood in there. It's just a bunch of little leaves. And again, mostly shade. Not a lot of direct sunlight is ideal for these. The strawberry as well. This columbine's really nice. The flower looks very cool if you're into that sort of thing. Again, it's a nice shady alternative to the coral bells or the strawberry. It doesn't spread like the strawberry. The strawberry is probably, and the coral bells both spread a bit. And if you do have a full sun area in your north-facing garden and want to have that woodland look, then a ceanothus is a great option. These you can kind of tell how big it might get though. You want to really give space to it, or expect to prune it at least twice a year perhaps. And lastly, we can go over some wildflowers. These are great. They're, if there's any spot of your garden that doesn't have a plant, you could probably sow a few of these seeds in the late fall, and you'll get an amazing pop of color in your garden. And they do well with minimal water, and but they get pretty large if you do water them frequently. So there's some poppies, some lupins, blue eyes. I'm sure some of you are familiar with this. I like planting these because they're not as big of a commitment for my garden. They're gonna die the following year. They're all annuals. I can swap them out with other flowers the following season if I'm interested in growing something different. And in some cases, they do last a second year if you keep watering them and babying them. I've had some poppies that have lasted 2 years, and they resprout. You should expect to have volunteers in the future though, especially for some of these plants that dehisce and pop their seeds out. You're probably gonna have them come up in other parts of your garden, which to me is fine, but that's just something for yourself to consider. These also do well in containers as well. You might just have to water them more often and also fertilize them, which you won't need to do if you're planting in ground. And lastly, let's talk about some other perennials that maybe aren't as easy to grow. There's a lot of variety, but they typically are more of a challenge. And that's flannel bush, which has this amazing yellow-orange flower. It's typically very sensitive to summer watering, and that's usually what I've heard people encountering, those problems. Manzanita is pretty slow growing, and it also has a very sensitive root system. So the first two plants, when you're transplanting them, you do want to be more careful. And throw in the bush poppy too. It's actually kind of sensitive. In my experience growing it in the nursery as well, we have the survival rate is 50% in some cases, in some batches. So it's just something to consider. But it's worth it if you can get it to work, definitely. And if you do want to plant these, then I would, emphasize all the slides we just covered, and encourage you to look even more into, judging your site and understanding your site and your plants. And the big day, planting day. It's time to get our hands dirty. Time to dig up some soil. Okay. I'll go over some quick things to consider. Hardening off your plants is very important, especially if you have very sensitive plants like the bush poppy I just mentioned, or plants that have been grown in a greenhouse. They're acclimated to a different environment. And if you throw those plants out into your yard right away, they're getting bombarded with direct sunlight in some cases, warmer atmospheric temperatures, and just the different environment can shock a lot of these plants and sometimes even kill them. So what is usually recommended is to just leave them in the shade by their site, as close to the site, but away from the sun for at least 1 week. 2 weeks if you really want to ensure it. And some people even take it farther and they like incrementally introduce the plant to full sun. You know, they put it in full sun for 30 minutes, take it back out, put it for 30 minutes the next day, and so on. You're gradually increasing, 30 minutes, 1 hour, et cetera, until you can keep it out there. And that's, of course, something you want to consider if you are investing a lot of money into these plants. You really want to ensure success for that in that situation. Yes, and of course, planting season for native plants is in mid to late fall. The rains really help establish the root system for the plant, and it helps prepare the plant going into that following summer. You can maybe get away with planting up to, I would say May, April or May. That's kind of like the latest. Definitely in June, that's when it starts getting really hot, July, and that's kind of where we cut off our planting season. Let's see, what else? Yeah, so really the major concern is the spread of soil-borne fungus, in this case, Phytophthora. It spreads in wet conditions, and the idea with planting in the fall is you're allowing the plant to in some cases outgrow any infection and just become established in the soil. And so for sensitive species and for larger plants, we're talking about like a 3-gallon plant. I've been showing you 1 gallons, but there's 3-gallon and 5-gallon, and of course the big 15-gallon. You do want to mind the root ball, and you want to take more care when planting it. And when you are positioning the root ball in your hole that you've just dug, it helps to keep maybe a bit of clearance, like maybe 1 inch over the soil level, depending on the size of the pot. And what that is going to do, it's going to ensure that over time, as the plant begins to settle into its location, it eventually levels with the ground. And, that's a bigger consideration for woody plants. Plants that you buy in a bigger size that are more mature and won't be able to outgrow any mistakes that are made during that planting. If you're planting herbaceous plants like the heuchera, or some penstemons, you can get away with not doing that just because they're more herbaceous, they're more likely to root and be fine over time. But if we're talking about manzanitas or Fremonts, you definitely want to stick to this approach. And of course, avoid disturbing or loosening the root ball. That's probably different from what you hear when planting veggies and tomatoes. I've been told, you can, when you're planting a tomato seedling, you can really break that up and loosen the root balls and try to get it to grow in your container. And you can beat it up a bit and it can take it. But with a lot of sensitive California natives, it's good to just leave the root ball alone. You don't have to fray the edges. Just put it in the ground as is. And when you're digging the hole, you want to ensure that you have enough space to work with and that you want to break up the soil around the root ball itself. And of course, when it's moist, it's going to allow for more contact between the soil particles and the roots of your plant. And with natives, fertilizing is typically not necessary, especially if you're planting in the ground. That's probably different from what you hear about growing avocados or growing orchard plants. typically you dig the hole for an avocado plant and you throw in some nitrogen fertilizer or some phosphorus fertilizer, and then you plant it. But for planting natives, it's typically not necessary. The only exception I can think of is if you're growing it in a container, then you might over time, maybe like once or twice a year, depending on what you're trying to achieve, you might need to fertilize it with some nitrogen, or if you're interested in the flowering, then maybe some flowering fertilizer mix. And of course, something I've been referencing is plant spacing. 3 feet is a good start, but of course that depends on what you're planting, as well as how willing you are to maintain your plant over time. Are you willing to spend a couple hours once every other month pruning back any new growth, shaping your plant, maintaining the space between your shrubs? If so, then you can get away with spacing them closer. And of course, some large shrubs like the sage, they'll need a lot more spacing. And like what I talked about, once or twice a year, you might need a prune. And that'll go up if you space them even more. Another thing with spacing to consider is competition for moisture in the soil and resources in your soil. So by spacing them out more, you're ensuring that each individual plant has access to the nutrients in the soil that it needs. And if you're planting them too close, you're potentially creating some competitive scenarios in your soil. And so we've planted, we've gotten our hands dirty, and now what do? We gotta water these things, right? It's December, it's 2021, and we're looking at summer right around the corner. Okay, so what's referred to is the establishment period. This is the first year after planting, where you're really trying to establish your plant, really trying to encourage deep root growth that's going to ensure that your plant lasts for easily the next 5 years, and in some cases much longer. So this is what I was referencing. Watering during the first year is very critical. You want to be more attentive to soil dryness and have a keener eye when you're testing your soil and checking for moisture content. So you want to water when the top 1 to 2 inches of the soil is dry. And you might get mixed results, but usually 3 to 5 gallons of water for every 1 gallon plant is required. And so that's very interesting when we're thinking about planting native plants as a way to cut back on water usage. You think, well, that's a lot of water, it sounds like. But of course, the mindset is you really establish it the first year so that in the future, you're kind of evening out and saving on water over time. Another rule is to water deep and infrequently. And so this is after the first year. You're going to start to ease up on the moisture level of your soil because your plant has been established and it can draw more water from the water table below the soil. And so you can get away with letting more of the topsoil dry. So you can wait until the top 3 to 4 inches of the soil is dry before you water it. And if you're watering during the summer, you want to do it in the early morning or preferably in the late afternoon when temperatures are cooler and the plant has a chance, the soil has a chance to drain of that excess water, that saturation level. And I have a good resource for watering native plants that I'll share with you guys after. It breaks down month by month how much water you should apply. And usually during the hotter months, it's recommended to try to just water once during those months. Especially for, a flannel bush, which is typically very sensitive to summer watering. And let's recap, okay? Come a long way. We've asked ourselves some questions, gathered as much information as we could, talked to all the people, bugged a bunch of people. We started picking some plants. You got to pick the right plant for the right place. That's the real take-home message. You don't want to try to plant something that's growing. You don't want to plant like a redwood in your Los Angeles garden, or if you do, you want to be informed enough that you're able to successfully grow that. Okay, so that's what this is all about. Just inform yourself as much as you can. Prepare your planting site. Again, we're talking about assessing the weed situation, the weed seed bank, any irrigation that needs to be installed, any trees that need to be removed, stuff like that. Of course, plant at the right time. This weather is perfect that we're having right now for planting. It's amazing. It's nice and cool. The soil will retain moisture for longer. And of course, water more during the first year, always, for native plants. And after that, you'll be rewarded with being able to, leave the plant alone more often, like I do, and let them kind of take care of themselves. And at that point, set year 2 with your native garden, you're just working on, shaping your plant, other things, and complementing them with buddy plants and, just maintaining your mulch layer and stuff like that. It's more upkeep. And of course, we'll find a way to get these websites to you. I included this plant hardiness website that's run by the USDA.gov website. And if you grow veggies and crops, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with heat zones. It's good to understand what zone you're in so you can get a better idea of how cold your site gets. And so if we're planting sensitive plants like some wildflowers, you want to understand, okay, when should I expect the coldest temperature so that I can plan to plant after that. And it's also good to know just when you're talking to other people, when you're talking to nursery reps, or when you're chatting with other gardeners. It's good to know and relay that information to one another. I also included a website for the California Floristic Province. It's run by the Jepson website. And what it does is it breaks down California into 3 provinces. I believe one of them is the California Floristic. There's the Great Basin and also the Desert Province. And what that does is it gives you an idea of the geographical differences found throughout California and how that might impact what's growing in any given spot. And so it's just another way to better understand natives, especially if you're really interested in just learning more about these plants. These are great resources for that. I would encourage you to dig deep into those websites and just get lost in them. And lastly, a lot of us know this website, calflora.org. It's awesome for understanding where a specific plant is distributed. It works, I've tested it, and it does work with common names, so you don't always need to know the scientific name. Although when you do search by common name, it'll just bring up more results because there's more matches, so you might need to do some more digging. But that's also an excellent resource for just learning more specifically about the plant, its growth form, its distribution, and all that. And we made it. That's it. I've given you as much information as I could. I think we're pretty good on time. Thanks so much for spending your weekend with me. I guess we can go over some questions if any of you have any. Kristen will relay them to me.
Yeah, Steven, we have a lot of really great questions, so I'm going to try to organize them as best as possible and kind of like topic.
Yeah.
So I have, let's talk about a little bit about watering.
Okay.
Judy asks, how close to the plant do you water and how broadly?
Okay. So there's this term referred to as the drip line when you're talking about trees and plants, and you're basically taking the diameter of the plant and you're projecting it onto the soil. So you want to imagine like a circle on the ground. You want to try to get water into that area. So the water directly underneath the canopy of your plant, because theoretically, however big the foliage gets, the root system expands that much as well, if not more. So that's a good starting point. If you have a tree, then that's different. The roots can get even larger. So the more area you can hit with water, the better, I would recommend. But also try not to water the base of the trunk. And when you're mulching specifically, you want to keep maybe 1 foot or 2 feet of the soil clear of mulch. right around the trunk base. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow the root collar to dry out and not get overly saturated. So yeah, my answer would be to just water the drip line, that area, but don't water the trunk itself.
Great. So kind of also in terms of irrigation, Chris is asking, I think this was a long time when you were mentioning drip irrigation, not to use that. How about a irrigation with a drip along pipe? So it's a black 1/4 inch or black half or brown 1/2 inch.
And you puncture holes in it, right? I think that's what he's
I
referring
would
to.
think so, or like would have like spaced out emitters, maybe. I'm not sure
You know,
exactly.
if the problem with drip irrigation, it's just such a low output, and for too long of a duration. If it's drip, I still wouldn't recommend it. You would have to do a lot of punctures, and at that point, I think you'd risk losing water pressure. So I still would recommend like a micro emitter, but micro emitting irrigation spaghetti line can run off of that type of irrigation line I think he's describing, which is the drip tape. You should be able to puncture that and then install a little spaghetti line that comes off of it and attaches to a micro emitter. So it's a good start to have that. But if you want to really avoid drip irrigation, then you should probably consider the micro sprayers.
Great. I have some mulching questions.
Yeah.
So let's see. Let me find them again. Where did it? Somebody asked if they can mulch with oak leaves.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah. What I've read is it's fine, and it's better if you can compost them first. Let them compost for a couple months, and then try to incorporate them into your mulch. Yeah, mulch is another thing that you want to do some research on. There's a lot of organizations that offer free mulch pickup, as long as you bring, your own truck and your own shovel and whatnot. One thing to consider is the origin of that mulch. Why was the tree mulched in the first place? Was it infected with something? You want to have that information before you decide to mulch with that. But yeah, oak leaves, I don't have experience mulching with oak leaves, so I can't really recommend it. The problem I see with oak leaves is because they're so waxy, they could impact the water penetration. So I guess, yeah, that's one thing I forgot to mention is with mulch, you're also spending more time trying to get water through the mulch into the soil. And so that's just something to consider. I would imagine that oak leaves might delay water penetration just because they're so waxy and they don't really allow for water to pass through.
Gotcha. All right. So this is kind of going into more plant selection recommendations. So there's a question about if you have any suggestions for ground cover under oaks on a slope. So it's south facing, but next to a house, which blocks a lot of sun.
Yeah. Let's see, I only know the scientific name. It's IVA. It's IVA Hyacina. I'm not too sure how to spell it. You can type that in. It's like a low shrub, and it does pretty okay in the shade underneath a tree. What else can you plant? Strawberries always do pretty well in that situation. There's some the island currant, Ribes viburnifolium, that would do nice on a slope. And let's see. Oh, there's I want to also mention a website that can help you with plant selection. It's we'll try to include it in the chat or somewhere. It's run by the Chino Hills Water Basin District. They have a garden planner section to their website, and they have a lot of native plants that you can look through. And yeah, we'll definitely try to get that website to you. But yeah, I would recommend yeah, crawling plants like strawberry or the ribes viburnifolium. That'd be nice.
Great. Um, so let's see. Can you recommend some fun bulbs? Do you know any fun bulbs?
Oh man, Calicortis is always cool if you could get it to flower. Um, yeah, we had bulbs last year, and we don't have them this year, but we're gonna try to get them out before the sale ends. Um, that's a nice one. Dichelostemma, that's always fun. Um, yeah, there's a few out there. It really depends on your soil quality, because some might be more sensitive to certain soil types. But Calicortis is always pretty cool. It looks really nice. I would go
Cool.
with that. Try that out if you can find it. Yeah, that'd
Yeah,
be
great. So also another recommendation question is, do you have any recommendations for planting natives in pots for people who may be renting or not have like in-ground space that they could plant? So they might be
great.
using pots instead.
Yeah, so when you're planting in pots, just make sure you're getting a lot of sunlight, and you should be able to get away with growing a few woody plants and herbaceous plants. There's a lot of monkey flowers that we have in pots in the garden, and we've had them. They looked good for about 3 years easily before they started outgrowing those pots, and I imagine they would bounce back if we gave them a bigger pot. Um, when you're growing in pots and you want a woody plant in there, the bigger the pot you can get, the better. And so yeah, monkey flower would be a great one, and it has a lot of flowers on it. There's a ton to pick from as well. Wildflowers do pretty well in pots. Just again, be sure that they're receiving south-facing light, and your watering needs might be higher if you're growing in pots. What else? I mean, theoretically, most of these plants will work in a pot. It's just going to take more time to prune them, and then in the future, potting them up into a bigger container, or yeah, just stuff like that. Annuals are a good start because you'll have them for a year, and the next year you can decide if you want to grow them again or if you want to grow something different.
Gotcha. I think so. Maybe let's see. I have some questions kind of about planting and establishing plants. So, when is the best time to plant an in-ground Matilija poppy that's been in a 5-gallon pot throughout the summer?
Oh, wow. It's been hot throughout the summer. I would say wait for a rain to come by, like the first rain of the season. And early in the morning is ideal. And yeah, that would be about it. I can't think of anything else to recommend with you said it was a Romnia?
Matilija poppy.
Yeah. Yeah, those are pretty robust. So you could wait for the first rain just to soften the soil a bit. Um, yeah, it should be fine.
Okay,
Definitely. It's going to get big. Those are nice.
great. So I also have another question about, can you move an already established plant to another area of a garden without killing it? And if so, when is a good time to do that?
Oh boy, yeah, that's tricky. Theoretically, yes. It depends how established it is. Um, I have a cousin who wants to dig up her rose bush, and that rose is maybe like 10 years old. And so if it's something like that, you might just need to take more precautions. I can't guarantee that it'll work, but the less established that it is, the more success you'll have. You do want to wait for temperatures to drop more, assuming it's a native. Wait for the temperatures to drop. Wait until we get some rain, and just set aside a weekend, some very early in the morning, and try to dig it up. When you do dig it up, the more of the root that you can get up, the better. So I'm talking like if the plant itself is like, I don't know, 3 feet wide, you'll probably have to aim for double that to dig up, to ensure that you're trying to get up as many of the roots as you can. But
Great.
yeah, that's tricky. If it's younger, you'll probably have better success. If it's older, you should maybe plan ahead and get some cuttings off of it just in case. Like root out some cuttings, just cover your bases.
Right. Great. So, okay, we have a couple questions. You kind of mentioned this, but do you recommend any sort of soil amendments when planting?
With natives, you don't really need to amend your soil. And most soil scientists will also say that because they're already adapted to the soil we have in California, there's really no need to amend it. And that's one reason why native gardens may conflict with, veggie gardens, because they just don't, they're adapted to it. I would only amend plants when they're in containers because they have a more constricted root system, and the nutrients in that small container deplete much faster, especially the nitrogen. So that's the only time I would really consider fertilizing with flowering fertilizer or nitrogen. Yeah, once you start messing with your soil, it's a different discussion because you're talking about changing the pH level, changing stuff like that. But yeah, you shouldn't need to.
Okay. And then I had, do you have any quick advice on when to prune buckwheats? And then kind of going along with that, can you say something about pruning white sage, Salvia, what is it? Salvia
Apiana.
Apiana, yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, this would be cool to make into its own talk in the future, like a pruning talk. That'd be awesome. But yeah, real quick, we can usually after the winter is a good time. The problem with pruning is avoiding excessively wet months and excessive moisture on the wounds that you're creating. So you want to give the plant enough time to dry out and callus those wounds so that no infection can occur in those wounds. So I would say, yeah, early, mid-spring is a good time. Late summer is a good time. So about a month ago would have been great to prune because it would have given the plant enough time to dry out those wounds before the more rainy months come.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And salvia, I mean, it's very hardy. You shouldn't have any problems pruning that.
Okay, great. We have a few more questions. Going to try to. Yeah. Is there a specific? You kind of touched on this a little bit, but is there a specific type of wood mulch that's best for native chaparral gardens? And kind of, that's the question.
I mean, any wood mulch that's local, I would say is best. When you're picking mulch, and any mulch that's healthy, that's from a non-infested plant. I'm not really aware on the research regarding that because I do know that some people claim that, eucalyptus mulch can have some negative effects on your plants. I'm not too familiar with that research, but from what I understand, as long as you're keeping the soil covered, you'll likely be okay. If you are worried about that, you can always, there's a website, and I think I have a book that covers it that I'll recommend right now, that will recommend different mulches. I believe so.
And everyone, I'll send out a follow-up email with Steven's websites that he's mentioned in any book, so you'll have that reference for later.
Yeah, and I on this last slide, I included my Instagram handle. You can always message me directly through that. I'd be more than happy to do some research and learn more about your questions and answer you. Definitely.
All right. I think we just have a few, just like quick kind of, you touched on a few of this, but recommendations for full shade tolerant plants. I believe you talked about it when you talked about your woodland garden.
Yeah, so like deep shade, if you have like a very shady area, some ferns would be nice. Some polypodiums, or I believe it's called polystechum, but or swordleaf fern is the common name. That would be a good one. Ferns do need a bit more water. That's one thing to consider. It really depends on what you want. Like if you want something more woody, you can go for a ribes. That'd be really nice. Or if you want something that's closer to the ground, those coral bells are really great. They do very well in the shade. Yeah, stuff like that. And well, should we go over like that website? Can I show them that a bit, or should we just send it to them? What do you think?
Yeah, maybe we'll just send it. Yeah, we'll just send the website, I think.
Yeah, there's an awesome website for that sort of stuff. It really narrows down like shade tolerant, full sun tolerance, stuff like that.
Okay. And I'm not sure I understand this question, but somebody's asking plant suggestions for north-facing stacked rock wall.
Ooh, I think I know what they're talking about.
Okay.
So it's receiving a lot of shade and there's not a lot of soil in there, right? Yeah, that's odd. I would have to get experimental with that. I guess you can maybe plant some rock daisies or something like that. I can imagine some Dudleyas might work. Those might be two good starting points. One thing to pay attention to is just on your walks, like when you're on a north-facing slope, when you're hiking, just kind of look around what's there. That'd be a great start as well. But yeah, that's interesting. But yeah, maybe Dudleyas, maybe, and maybe like some rock-loving plants.
And then kind of going back to the shade, is pitcher sage one that does well in shade?
I think it can tolerate some shade. It's just going to get a bit leggy if it's in full shade, and you probably won't see it flower as much. So it really does do best in the full sun.
Great. I think one last, if you have any tips on establishing flannel bush, do you have any tips for that? I know that was one of the tricky perennials, but
yeah, try to get a flannel bush that's not root bound, that has healthy roots. You can do that by just popping the plant out and just observing the roots. If you see them excessively coiling around, then you might not want to get that plant. Let's see, what else? You still want to follow the fall planting guidelines. Wait for the rains to come, wait for it to cool down. You don't need to amend, and keep it in a site that's gonna have a lot of sun, because it likes the sun, it likes the heat. And yeah, that's really all I can recommend. In terms of size plant that you want to buy, I'm thinking like a mid-size plant would be a good start. You know, like a 1 gallon would do well. But yeah, your mileage may vary, just something to consider.
all right. I think one last little question. Somebody has shared that they've managed to kill 2 to 3 white sage plants that they've bought, and she's thinking maybe too much water. Do you think that might be the culprit?
Perhaps. I'd have to look at pictures of it. If she's taken any, she can send them over. Also, like how big was the plant? Yeah, it might have been overwatered. I can't say for sure though.
Okay. All right. I think we've addressed all of your questions either in Steven's presentation or through this little Q&A segment. So, but if you do have more follow-up questions, you can reach out to either myself or Steven. I'll put my email in the chat right now, just in case you didn't get it, an email from me earlier today. And just wanted to, sorry, I'm typing at the same time. Just wanted to remind everyone that a recording of this class will be up on the digital content page of the website, which is calbg.org. And I should have that up by Monday. And I will send a follow-up email with all of Steven's references about, either books or websites that he mentioned in the class today. So you have that to reference later as you're kind of planning out your gardens. And if you did not receive the discount code, just email me and I'll make sure that you get that discount code. So if you're going to go shop at the online store for Grow Native Nursery, you'll have that also. And I think that is all, unless Steven, do you have anything else you'd like to?
I have some books, like if you're really interested in learning about specifically like soil science or just the plants and horticulture in general. For soil science, this book is really great and easy to understand, and it's not that thick. You can see that. The language it uses is very, simple, and it's not too overwhelming. You can find this on, Amazon or wherever.
Can you read the title? I couldn't.
Oh, I'm sorry. It says Soil Science Simplified, 4th edition. Oh, is it coming up backwards?
No, it's not. It's just
okay.
it's just
Soil
small.
Science Simplified, and it just breaks down some basic concepts if you're really looking into understanding your own soil a lot more. If you live by the San Bernardino Mountains and around this area, this book's very helpful for some quick, rough IDs of plants, flora of the Santa Ana River, and it just breaks plants down by their form as well as their parts. And it's never going to give you like an exact idea or understanding of what the plant is, but it's a good start, and it's a good way to build up your botanizing skills and build up that language to ID plants in the future. And lastly, I have some good gardening books that I've used from time to time. This one's called California Friendly, and it just kind of breaks down some similar topics that I covered in the talk with planning your garden and like learning what to plant. And then I have this other plant here, other book, California Native Gardening. It actually has a month-by-month guide, which I think is pretty cool. And of course, it's always best to use all these sources together and not rely just on one. So, something to add to your coffee table, something to add to your library. And of course, the good old Audubon stuff. That's always fun to have. I use this a lot. It's really fun. Again, it's not like exact plant matches, but it gives you a start. If you see the flower, if you have a picture of the flower, you can always reference it with something like this. And yeah, that's all. There's some websites on my slideshow that will get to you. Those all cover different things. They're really cool. And yeah, thanks so much. This was awesome. Hopefully we can do it more.
Yes,
Right?
definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Steven. I think it was such a great class today. You can tell by the questions that people were getting a lot out of it. So
Yeah,
thank
no
you
problem.
so much. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope to offer more horticulture classes on various topics like pruning and propagation. So check back and see what we have listed either on our website or through email blasts. So thank you all very much.
Thanks,
We hope
guys. Girls,
you have
bye.
a great day. Bye.